Before we ask whether Zeus was a great king, we may need to ask a more uncomfortable question. What if Olympus was never stable in the first place? That sounds almost absurd. After all, Zeus is remembered as the ruler who defeated the Titans, seized control of the cosmos, and established the divine order that would define Greek mythology. In most retellings, he is the symbol of victory. The thunderbolt. The king on the throne. The force that transformed chaos into civilization. But there is a problem with that story. If Zeus truly created order, why does Olympus seem permanently surrounded by conflict? Why are the gods constantly competing, conspiring, resisting, and challenging one another? Why does the realm that supposedly represents divine perfection often look more like a kingdom struggling to hold itself together? And perhaps most importantly, why does the strongest ruler in mythology spend so much time managing instability? That question changes everything. Because the moment we stop looking at Zeus as a god and start looking at him as a ruler, a strange contradiction begins to emerge. Strength and leadership are not the same thing. Winning power and sustaining power are not the same achievement. History is filled with conquerors who could seize a throne but could not create a system capable of surviving without constant intervention. The image most people remember is the lightning bolt. But the image we should remember is something else entirely. An empty throne on Olympus. Not because Zeus is absent, but because the throne itself becomes the center of the mystery. What kind of system requires one individual to remain the ultimate source of authority forever? And what happens when every major decision, every conflict, every balance of power depends on a single figure holding everything together? At first glance, Olympus appears invincible. The gods possess unimaginable abilities. Their enemies are defeated. Their kingdom stands above the mortal world. Yet beneath that image of perfection, another reality quietly exists. A kingdom can survive external threats and still suffer from internal weakness. In fact, some of the most fragile systems in history are the ones that look strongest from the outside. That is where Zeus becomes far more interesting than the legends usually suggest. His role was not simply to rule Olympus. His influence shaped the very structure of Olympus. The rules, the hierarchy, the relationships, the balance between authority and obedience, all of it revolved around him. And that creates a troubling possibility. What if Olympus was not threatened by chaos despite Zeus? What if it was threatened by chaos because of the way his system was built? Notice the distinction. This is not a question about whether Zeus was powerful. No serious myth ever doubts that. This is a question about legitimacy. Because power can force obedience. Power can silence opposition. Power can defeat rivals. But power alone cannot guarantee stability. And when a system depends too heavily on a single ruler, every success hides a deeper vulnerability. The lightning bolt becomes a symbol of strength. Yet somewhere behind that lightning, another symbol begins to appear. A crack running through Olympus itself. Small at first. Almost invisible. But large enough to raise a question that will guide everything that follows. Did Zeus spend his reign protecting Olympus from disorder, or was the disorder already built into the foundation of the kingdom he created? If Olympus contained a weakness from the very beginning, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where exactly was that weakness hiding? Most people look for flaws in individuals. A jealous queen. A rebellious god. A defiant titan. But systems rarely become unstable because of a single difficult personality. Systems become unstable when they create incentives that make conflict inevitable. And that is where the story becomes far more unsettling. Think about what Zeus actually represented inside the structure of Olympus. Not merely power, but the concentration of power. He was not just the king. He was the center of gravity around which every relationship, every alliance, and every rivalry revolved. At first, that seems like a strength. A strong center creates unity. A strong center creates order. A strong center creates direction. But there is a hidden cost. The stronger the center becomes, the weaker everything around it may become. This is a paradox that appears again and again throughout history. Organizations, governments, even families often become dependent on a single dominant figure. Decisions flow upward. Responsibility flows upward. Authority flows upward. And over time, the system loses the ability to stabilize itself. The ruler becomes the solution to every problem. Which means the ruler also becomes the source of every future crisis. That contradiction sits at the heart of Olympus. Consider one of the most revealing symbols in the entire mythology, Athena standing beside Zeus. Not beneath him. Not against him. Beside him. Athena represents wisdom, strategy, foresight, and restraint. In many ways, she embodies the qualities that transform raw power into sustainable leadership. Yet wisdom does not sit on the throne. Power does. And that distinction may be more important than it first appears. Because a kingdom ruled primarily through wisdom creates legitimacy. People follow because they believe in the system. A kingdom ruled primarily through authority creates dependence. People follow because the center remains strong. Those two models can look identical during periods of success. But they behave very differently during periods of stress. And stress reveals truths that prosperity often hides. This brings us to another image worth remembering. A great banquet on Olympus. The gods assembled together. Celebration. Prestige. Immortality. From a distance, it looks like the perfect symbol of unity. Yet symbols often conceal the very tensions they are meant to hide. The more closely we examine Olympus, the more we discover a strange pattern. The kingdom appears powerful, yet constantly negotiates internal fractures. It appears unified, yet repeatedly encounters competing interests. It appears eternal, yet behaves as though stability must be continuously defended. Why? Because authority can suppress conflict without resolving it. An unresolved conflict has a habit of returning. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. Quietly. Like a crack spreading through stone. This is why the problem may never have been a particular rival or challenger. Those figures may have been symptoms rather than causes. Visible expressions of something deeper embedded within the structure itself. A system built around one indispensable figure creates an invisible vulnerability. The more essential that figure becomes, the harder it becomes for the system to function independently. And suddenly the question is no longer about Zeus. It becomes a question about power itself. Can any ruler create lasting order if the survival of the entire system depends on that ruler remaining at the center forever? Or does dependence eventually transform strength into fragility? Because if Olympus truly rested upon a single pillar, then another mystery begins to emerge. Was the greatest threat to Olympus ever outside its walls? Or was it hidden in the very foundation that held the kingdom together? If dependence was the hidden weakness inside Olympus, then the next question becomes even more dangerous. What happens when the people closest to the center stop trusting the center itself? This is where the crisis begins to emerge, not as a single event, but as a pattern. Because the most revealing test of any system is not how it treats enemies. It is how it manages allies. A ruler expects resistance from opponents. That is normal. The real warning sign appears when friction begins to emerge among those who are supposed to benefit from the system. And this is precisely the contradiction that surrounds Olympus. The kingdom was populated by beings of extraordinary power, intelligence, influence, and ambition. Yet the structure of the kingdom placed all authority at a single focal point. The result was a tension that could never fully disappear. The stronger the individuals became, the harder it became for one center to contain them. That tension introduces a problem that appears in every age. Power attracts talent. Power also attracts ambition. And ambition rarely enjoys permanent subordination. Consider the symbolic role surrounding the throne. Athena represents wisdom. Poseidon represents independent power. Hera represents internal legitimacy. Each figure embodies a force that any stable system must learn to integrate. But integration is different from control. A leader can command obedience. A leader cannot command genuine alignment. Those are not the same thing. And the gap between them often determines whether a civilization thrives or slowly fractures. This is why the image of a cracked Olympus becomes so important. Not because the kingdom is visibly collapsing. Because from the outside, it still appears magnificent. The crack exists beneath the surface. Invisible. Growing. Ignored. A contradiction hidden inside success. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. The strongest institutions often become convinced that strength itself guarantees permanence. The more successful they become, the less attention they pay to the structural tensions accumulating underneath. The danger is not weakness. The danger is believing that strength eliminates weakness. And that may be the deeper lesson hidden inside Zeus's role. He was extraordinarily effective at establishing authority. But authority and legitimacy follow different rules. Authority asks, who has the power? Legitimacy asks, why should that power continue to exist? One can be imposed. The other must be continually earned. That distinction changes the entire way we view Olympus. Because suddenly the recurring tensions are no longer random disturbances. They become signals. Symptoms. Warnings. Evidence that the system may be struggling with a question it cannot fully answer. What gives the throne its right to rule? The longer we examine the structure, the stranger it becomes. The kingdom appears eternal, yet constantly manages instability. The ruler appears supreme, yet remains surrounded by challenges. The hierarchy appears fixed, yet repeatedly encounters pressure from within. Every solution seems to generate another problem. Every victory appears to leave an unanswered question. And that leads us toward an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing Olympus was never rebellion. Perhaps rebellion was merely the visible expression of something deeper. A system built around one indispensable figure inevitably creates a shadow. The shadow is dependence. And dependence eventually produces fear. Not fear among the ruled. Fear inside the system itself. Fear of what happens if the center weakens. Fear of what happens if authority is questioned. Fear of what happens if legitimacy and power begin moving in different directions. At that point, the problem is no longer political. It becomes philosophical. Because a kingdom can survive enemies. A kingdom can survive crises. A kingdom can even survive mistakes. But can it survive a contradiction at the heart of its own identity? And that is where the mystery begins to deepen. What if Olympus was not trapped in a struggle between order and chaos? What if it was trapped in something far more difficult to solve, a struggle between power and wisdom, where the throne possessed one in abundance and never fully secured the other? What if the deepest problem was not that Olympus lacked wisdom, but that wisdom and authority were deliberately separated from one another? That possibility reveals a layer of the system that is easy to miss because it does not appear in battles, disputes, or dramatic confrontations. It appears in architecture. Every civilization, whether mythical or historical, eventually answers the same question: where does decision-making ultimately reside? Not where intelligence resides. Not where virtue resides. Where authority resides. And those are not always the same place. This is where the symbolism of Athena becomes more important than Athena herself. Her role is not merely to represent intelligence. Her influence is to embody a principle. The principle that understanding and control are different forms of power. One illuminates reality. The other directs reality. In an ideal system, those forces work together. But Olympus presents a more complicated picture. Wisdom remains close to power, yet distinct from it. Present, yet not sovereign. Respected, yet not ultimate. And that arrangement may reveal more about the structure of Olympus than any single conflict ever could. Because once wisdom becomes advisory rather than foundational, a subtle transformation occurs. The system begins prioritizing preservation over understanding. Stability over adaptation. Authority over self-examination. At first, this appears beneficial. Decisions become faster. Challenges can be contained. order can be maintained. But beneath the surface, a hidden cost accumulates. The system gradually loses its ability to question itself. That is the revelation. The greatest weakness of many powerful structures is not corruption. It is self-confirmation. The inability to recognize flaws because success itself becomes evidence that no flaws exist. Imagine a great hall atop Olympus. A magnificent table surrounded by immortal beings. Every seat occupied by a force capable of shaping the world below. It appears to symbolize unity. Yet another interpretation is possible. The table itself becomes a memory fragment. A symbol of concentrated influence trapped inside a structure that depends upon perpetual balance. Every voice matters. Yet one voice remains final. Every perspective exists. Yet one perspective ultimately governs. The question is not whether that arrangement can function. The question is how long it can function before tension accumulates faster than adaptation. This shifts the conversation beyond mythology. Beyond kings. Beyond gods. Entire civilizations have faced the same dilemma. Institutions rise because they create order. They endure because they learn. And they decline when preserving authority becomes more important than understanding reality. Suddenly Olympus begins to resemble something larger than a divine kingdom. It becomes a model of an enduring human pattern. The pattern in which systems become so focused on maintaining control that they gradually lose the flexibility required for long-term stability. The consequence is profound. The threat no longer comes from external rivals. It comes from structural rigidity. From the inability to evolve as complexity increases. From the growing gap between what a system believes about itself and what it actually is. And now another symbol emerges. Not the lightning bolt. Not the throne. But Athena standing behind the throne. Wisdom close enough to be consulted, yet distant enough to be ignored. That image forces a disturbing new question. What if the central problem of Olympus was never that Zeus possessed too much power? What if the deeper problem was that the system itself elevated authority above understanding, creating a flaw so fundamental that even the most powerful ruler could never fully overcome it? And if that is true, then the mystery changes completely. We are no longer asking why instability kept appearing within Olympus. We are beginning to ask whether instability was the inevitable result of the very principles upon which Olympus was built. If instability was embedded in the principles of Olympus itself, then we arrive at the question hidden beneath every other question. What was Zeus actually building? Most people assume he was building a kingdom. A government. A divine order. But the deepest revelation points somewhere else entirely. Zeus was not merely building a system of rule. He was building a system of dependence. That distinction changes everything. Because a kingdom can survive flawed leaders if its institutions are strong. A civilization can survive crises if its foundations are resilient. But a structure built around a single indispensable center eventually becomes trapped by its own design. The ultimate irony is that this weakness often appears as strength. The more essential the center becomes, the more impressive the system appears. Yet every increase in centralization quietly increases fragility. This is the core revelation hidden within Olympus. The fatal weakness was never a rival god, a rebellious force, or an external threat. The weakness was the assumption that lasting order could be secured through concentration rather than distribution. Zeus did not simply sit at the center of Olympus. Olympus gradually became unable to imagine itself without him. That is a very different problem. It transforms the role of Zeus from ruler into structural necessity. And once a system depends upon a single figure for coherence, every challenge becomes existential. Not because the challenge is powerful, but because the system has lost the ability to absorb disruption naturally. Imagine once more the image of the throne. Earlier it appeared as a symbol of authority. Now it reveals its deeper meaning. The throne is not merely a seat of power. It is a dependency machine. Every path leads toward it. Every decision flows through it. Every tension eventually returns to it. The throne becomes a memory fragment for an idea larger than mythology itself. A system that cannot function without constant intervention has not solved instability. It has postponed it. This explains why wisdom alone could not resolve the problem. It explains why strength alone could not resolve the problem. It explains why recurring tensions continued to emerge regardless of who surrounded the throne. The issue was architectural. The system rewarded concentration while requiring cooperation. It elevated authority while depending upon independent actors. It sought permanence through control in a reality defined by complexity. And complexity always pushes back. Suddenly the roles of the surrounding figures take on a new meaning. Athena is no longer simply wisdom. She becomes the unrealized possibility of a different model. Prometheus is no longer simply a challenger. He becomes a symbol of perspectives the system struggles to integrate. Hera is no longer merely opposition. She becomes evidence that legitimacy cannot be manufactured by authority alone. Each figure reveals a pressure point. Each pressure point reveals a structural limitation. Together they expose the hidden truth: Olympus was not failing because powerful personalities existed. Powerful personalities reveal the limits of a design that depended too heavily on a single source of order. This is why the story expands far beyond mythology. The pattern appears in empires, corporations, political movements, and even families. Whenever a system becomes identified with one indispensable figure, the same paradox emerges. The leader becomes the source of stability. The leader also becomes the source of vulnerability. The greater the success, the greater the dependence. The greater the dependence, the greater the hidden risk. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson concealed beneath the image of Zeus and Olympus. The question was never whether one powerful ruler could create order. The real question is whether any system built around a single center can ever achieve lasting stability at all. Because if dependence is the price of order, then what eventually happens when the system must confront a future larger than the person who holds it together? Once we understand the hidden weakness, the next question is no longer how the system was built. The question becomes, what was the cost? Not the cost to a single ruler. Not the cost to a single generation. The cost paid by the system itself. Because every design choice leaves a legacy. Every structure teaches future generations how power should function. And the legacy of Olympus may be far more significant than the fate of any individual god. The first consequence is subtle. A system built around dependence gradually changes the behavior of everyone inside it. When authority becomes the primary source of stability, initiative begins to shrink. Responsibility begins to concentrate. Independent judgment becomes less valuable than proximity to the center. Over time, the culture adapts to the structure. This is why the deepest consequences are often psychological before they become political. The system teaches people how to think long before it tells them how to act. The same pattern appears throughout human history. Organizations become less innovative. Institutions become less adaptive. Communities become less resilient. Not because their members lack talent, but because the structure discourages distributed responsibility. The result is a paradox. The stronger the central authority appears, the weaker the surrounding ecosystem may become. This brings us back to one of the most powerful memory fragments in the entire story, the banquet on Olympus. At first glance, it represents success, prestige, permanence. Yet viewed through a different lens, it becomes something else. A gathering of extraordinary figures connected by a structure that requires constant maintenance. The banquet is not merely a celebration. It is a reminder. Stability is being performed. Stability is being displayed. Stability is being protected. But truly resilient systems rarely need to prove their stability. They demonstrate it naturally through their ability to absorb change. That distinction forms the heart of the legacy. The lesson is not about divine politics. The lesson is about the difference between order and resilience. Order creates predictability. Resilience creates survival. One can exist without the other. And that realization expands the scale of the story dramatically. Suddenly Olympus becomes a mirror reflecting recurring patterns across civilizations. Empires rise around extraordinary leaders. Corporations rise around visionary founders. Movements rise around charismatic figures. Their greatest achievements often emerge from concentration. Yet their greatest vulnerabilities frequently emerge from the same source. The very force that enables rapid success can later limit long-term endurance. This is why the image of the cracked Olympus continues to matter. The crack is not destruction. It is a warning. A symbol of accumulated tension that has not yet reached its final consequence. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Zeus's system. Not that it failed. Not that it succeeded. But that it revealed a permanent dilemma in human affairs. Every society wants strong leadership. Every society also needs structures capable of surviving beyond that leadership. Those goals often support each other in the beginning. Eventually, they begin to compete. The consequence extends even further. It reaches into the way people understand authority itself. Should stability come from institutions or individuals? From principles or personalities? From wisdom distributed throughout a system or power concentrated at the top? These questions remain unresolved because they are not ancient questions. They are modern questions. They are timeless questions. Which is why the legacy of Olympus continues long after the mythology ends. The gods become symbols. The kingdom becomes a pattern. The throne becomes a warning. And the empty space behind the throne becomes the deepest mystery of all. If every system eventually faces a choice between preserving authority and increasing resilience, what happens when those two goals begin pulling in opposite directions? And if the strongest kingdoms are not necessarily the most durable, how should we rethink what true stability actually means? In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Olympus is not that it was ruled by gods. It is that its deepest questions remain profoundly human. Across the centuries, people have remembered the lightning bolt. They have remembered the throne. They have remembered the king at the center of the heavens. Yet symbols often survive because they contain truths larger than the stories that created them. And the symbols of Olympus continue to endure because they point toward a tension that every generation eventually encounters. The empty throne. The cracked mountain. The banquet of immortals. Athena standing just behind power rather than holding it. These images linger in the mind because they are not merely fragments of mythology. They are reflections of choices that individuals, institutions, and civilizations continue to make. The final insight may be simpler than it first appears. The story was never ultimately about whether one ruler succeeded or failed. It was about the relationship between strength and wisdom. Between control and understanding. Between the desire to create order and the challenge of creating something capable of enduring beyond the person who created it. That is why the legacy of Olympus extends far beyond its own world. The kingdom becomes a metaphor. The gods become archetypes. The conflicts become mirrors. And suddenly the distance between mythology and modern life begins to disappear. Every generation inherits structures built by those who came before. Governments. Organizations. Traditions. Families. Ideas. Some appear solid. Some appear permanent. Some appear untouchable. Yet beneath every structure lies the same question: was it designed merely to function? Or was it designed to endure? Those are not always the same thing. A system can achieve extraordinary success and still leave behind hidden vulnerabilities. A leader can create stability and still unintentionally create dependence. A civilization can reach immense heights while quietly planting the seeds of future fragility. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that human beings fail to build lasting systems. The tragedy is that success often makes weaknesses harder to see. The higher the mountain rises, the easier it becomes to mistake elevation for permanence. And that may be why the image of Olympus continues to resonate. Not because it offers certainty. Because it refuses certainty. It leaves us standing between admiration and doubt. Between achievement and consequence. Between power and wisdom. Perhaps that is the reason these myths survive while so many other stories fade away. They do not provide final answers. They preserve enduring questions. The lightning still flashes above the mountain. The throne still stands. The cracks are still there. And somewhere behind all of those symbols remains a mystery that extends far beyond mythology itself. If the greatest challenge facing any system is not defeating its enemies but overcoming the limitations hidden within its own foundations, then the most important question is no longer about kings, gods, or ancient kingdoms. It is about us. When we build our institutions, our communities, our beliefs, and even our identities, are we creating structures that can endure because they are resilient? Or are we creating structures that appear strong only because they have not yet been tested by the future? And perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all is this: the difference between those two paths may not become visible until long after the builders are gone.